Hey there. I know it's been a minute or two. I think it's been 3 weeks since I shot a video. And when I started doing this, my goal was to get one out every week. This is Ron with Ron's Fuel Stop. And then lately we've been going through preparing for perilous times. And I've been shooting videos now for about 8 years. And many times I've started and made a commitment to keep them consistent because I know, people check them out and then all of a sudden they're gone and you probably quit checking them out since they ain't there. I have in the past had a trucking emphasis. I am a trucker. I am at, I think it's called Big Chief Truck Stop. It's near Buffalo, New York. I'm on my way back from Augusta, Maine, and then picking up in Middlebury, Vermont, and on my way back to Schofield, Wisconsin, to turn some more out-of-state cheese into Wisconsin cheese. Yes, that's what we do. Cheese ages. A lot of times it sits, you see it little on the package, and it says 1-year cheddar, 2-year cheddar, 5-year cheddar. That's because it sits in a warehouse. The cheese I got on board is in cedar boxes, and with no packaging or anything. It's just in a cedar box, 30-pound blocks, and that's how cheese ages. And there you go. But that's not what we're talking about today. So in my videos, I've been talking about perilous times, but kind of like to use layman's terms, end of the world scenario. But more biblically stated, what do we do when it's the end of the age? And maybe some of you don't believe that, or maybe you didn't believe that, but in the times of late, we see pretty much everything fulfilled for Jesus to come back. But the possibility is also scripturally, biblically, that we will live through some difficult times, and some believe we'll live through the whole tribulation. So whether you are post-trib, that would be that situation, mid-trib, which means you'll live through some of it, or pre-trib, which we all wish we could be, which means no Christians will suffer through any tribulation. Well, I don't think that's going to be the case, and that's why I've released these videos to help us prepare to be strong. But I've noticed some of my following dropping off, and I've been trying to think about, well, what's going on here? And I know what's missing is the practical side. And let me tell you about something that happened to me today that kind of made me motivated to do this video. I have talked about in the past how, God speaks to us through His Word. And if He never spoke to you any other way, you can't say that He hasn't spoken to you, because He's spoken to all of us through His Word, through the Bible. You read it. Yes, it was for people 2,000 years ago. And in many situations, it was written to some specific situation. But in another sense, it is for all time. And people have read it throughout the last few thousand years and been impacted and changed by it. And I believe that the Lord's Word is literally living, as it says, sharper than a two-edged sword, cutting asunder, the things that should be and shouldn't be. It separates them. So, but what about some practical stuff? So today, I drove up 87 that comes up out of New Hampshire, and it goes up into Vermont. Absolutely beautiful. So beautiful. Almost as beautiful as Northwest Montana. It doesn't get as high of elevation, and there's way more people, but it's still remote. I mean, it's so remote that I could not go east and west. I had to go 400 miles to travel about 150 miles, because I had to drive in the shape of a W from Maine to Vermont in order to stay in the valleys, because there's just not roads for trucks that go over the mountains. And so I drove right through this one town. And then a few hours later, and by the way, that town was called Bethel, which means house of God. And a few hours later, I'm listening to podcasts, and some of you listen to podcasts. One of the ones I often listen to is Tucker Carlson. I figure, well, anybody that gets kicked off of Fox because of what he's saying, he's probably a guy that's worth listening to. I love his style. He does a lot of interviews, and to me, that's the one thing you don't get in news media of any sort today. You get, I don't care which one you're listening to, you get a spin. You get what some wealthy corporate people want you to hear so that you develop an opinion and you will do or think certain things. And how do I know that? Well, when they interview somebody, they always ask very pointed leading questions, and then they chop out one little phrase that was said, and that's the one they use again and again in a soundbite. And when somebody interviews in a way where they just let the person being interviewed, the interviewee, just go on and on, you get to understand what they're saying. And then, tell me more. That might be a good question. Okay. And so I think I hear you saying such and such. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying this. And let the interviewee say what they're going to say. And then if it's just on the internet and it's not on anybody's network, let the chips fall where they will. So Tucker Carlson does a lot of interesting interviews, and lately he has started his own podcasting channel. And I listen to most of them. Today, though, he interviewed a family friend, just a regular guy, not anybody famous. And so when Tucker Carlson was young, he lived in California with his dad and his mom. His mom was originally from Paris, but she left them when he was young. And they had money, and he admits that. He says he, going to private schools and, having houses in different states. And one of those states that they had a house in was Maine. And where they had their house was right next door to this guy that now he's interviewing. The guy's 52 years old. I think he's very close to the same age as Tucker. And he's known him his whole life. And he's talking about all the things they've done together. They've gone and made wood. They've gone and, shot every weapon that you can think of to learn how to shoot different guns. They have learned how to, survive in the woods. This is a guy that you don't really think of as that kind of a person. And, so he's asking this guy questions, and the questions that he's asking is about what would you do if there was no more electricity? What would you do if the power grid went down? What would you do if the big cities became so chaotic that everybody fled them? What would you do if there was no food supply? Well, here's a guy that owns a few hundred acres in the Northeast, and he has wild game. He has animals that he raises. His wife has a beautiful big garden. She supplies food for several restaurants and 20 different families. And they go through one thing at a time as to what they think would be helpful if you can't just go to the store and get what you need. And it made me think about that's the other side of preparing for perilous times. I've never really been a prepper. I've had some water in my basement, so we have water to flush the toilet with if we got no power. But I've never accumulated some of the things you'd need. And you say, well, that just is not, this is America, that's never going to happen. And I think some of you would realize that could happen. And it'd be very easy for someone to knock out our power grid. In fact, just by natural causes. And with the push toward all these different unstable power sources, like wind energy, we saw what happened in Texas when Ice storms knocked out all their wind energy. Solar panels, also in Texas, ice storm, thousands of acres of solar panels ruined from hail damage. Good old coal, pretty reliable. It just keeps on chugging and producing electricity. So does natural gas. But anything, if somebody with bad intentions wanted to target power plants, they can be taken out. So, in our home, we've done a few things. We have a generator. I try to keep an extra 5 gallons of gas. I try to teach my wife how to start the generator, and what we would do. Most of you maybe have a flashlight or you have candles, so you can't say you're not a prepper at all. It's actually irresponsible not to be any type of a prepper, that if the power goes out, you can't even find your way to the bathroom. You got to be prepared for those types of situations. But we have experienced already in the U.S. how people's power has gone out for more than a day, 2 days, 3 days. It can be very difficult. What would you do? You say, well, we really don't have the money to have a plan. Well, some plans really don't cost any money. They just mean being prepared. What if, something happened to one of the metro cities in our country? Do you have family that lives there? Have you had conversations about where you might meet up? Whose property is the most logical or the safest to go to, so that you can combine resources? People say, well, this would never happen. This is America. But it has happened again and again around the world. And let me just say one more thing, not to be too alarming and not to make too many of you flush my channel. But I've read a lot about the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm fascinated by Russian history and how much beautiful culture, and I've mentioned this before, beautiful culture that the Russian nation, the Russian people have in their past, 1800s into the early 1900s, before the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. So anybody of means who owned houses, owned property, their focus was greatly on the culture of their society, and they were the ones responsible for bringing so much of the culture into play, from music to literature to art, and preserving that. But what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution is they just decided that the haves were the people who had too much, and the have-nots should just take from the haves. They weren't looking for a situation to have everybody have equal opportunity. They were looking for a situation to begin to have not even equal outcome, but to switch the outcomes from the people who have had through generations provision through their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, to have that just taken from them. And people were, first of all, they were breaking up their furniture and burning it for heat if they had a house. And eventually they were kicked out of their houses. Many of them were killed. Many of them were put in prison. And then everybody who was a have-not moved into all of those places. And I think you've seen enough of what's happened ideologically in our country that we're only brief steps from the practicality of that taking place. If you own a house, you own property, you are the target of a portion of our culture. I think it's unfair that you have that, especially if you've had it for more than a generation. That if you have 100 acres, boy, think how many people could live on that 100 acres. And then you have it all to yourself. How unfair is that? And so, if you don't think that that's kind of atrocious in America, then you're probably a person who doesn't own anything and would be benefited by the fact that, if we took from the people who own things and gave them to those who don't, that seems like a great idea. But people have sacrificed, they've been creative, they've worked, it's almost as hard to keep something as it is to get it in the first place. And I think in little ways we've proven that people who are given things often can't even hang on to them. Especially like if you win the lottery, usually you don't have any money within a couple of years because you haven't learned the character that it takes to hang on to what you have. So we don't know, if Jesus will come back before these types of difficult things happen. I think a lot of theology changed after World War I and World War II because the people in Europe they did not believe that the Lord would allow what took place in their countries. I mean, German army moved into the houses and the villages of France. They moved in, took the wives as their own while their husbands were out in war. Many people were killed. Everything was destroyed. I mean, you ever listen to or read the book The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Very interesting. She really goes into detail as to how, it's fiction, but it's based on truth, how those kinds of things could happen. A lot of good books about that out. Anyway, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but I ain't trying to change anybody's thinking. But I am thinking that when something comes across your path that seems too significant to be a coincidence, that possibly it's not a coincidence. It could be the Lord speaking to you, preparing you for something for your future. Anyway, let's listen to Him and let's be prepared for whatever times the Lord brings us. Bless you today.